It's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to this lecture and to serve as a kind of guide for the evening. But before we get much further, let us just take a moment to quickly bow our heads and begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God, we thank you for the vast and wondrous universe you have created and for the gift of reason and intellect you have bestowed upon us. We are humbled and awestruck by the beauty and complexity of your creation, and we are grateful for the opportunity to explore and understand the natural world through the lens of science. May our intellectual endeavors always be guided by a spirit of humility, seeking to glorify you through our discoveries and to use our knowledge for the betterment of humanity and the world. Help us to see the sacred in the scientific and to recognize that faith and science are not in opposition, but two paths that lead us to a deeper understanding of your truth. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, thank you again for joining us for the annual Dr. Benjamin T. Chu Distinguished Lecture here at St. Norbert College. The annual Chu Lecture celebrates the meeting of faith and reason at Catholic institutions by hosting scholars who have distinguished themselves in the natural sciences and who have demonstrated that faith plays a significant role in their work and their personal lives. We would like to thank Dr. Benjamin Chu, a 1955 graduate of St. Norbert College and a former trustee, for sponsoring this annual lecture. Dr. Chu is one of the college's earliest Asian students. He was born in China in 1932 and was steered to St. Norbert College by Irish Jesuits who ran a high school in Hong Kong. After St. Norbert College, he pursued graduate work at Cornell University, where he studied under the Nobel Prize-winning physical chemist, Dr. Peter Debye. Dr. Chu would go on to a distinguished career as a chemist, a researcher, and an entrepreneur at SUNY Stony Brook. Unfortunately, Dr. Chu is still in California. He's not able to join us tonight, but let us just take a moment to express appreciation for his generosity and support. I would now like to welcome forward Dr. David Poyster to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Dr. Poyster is a professor of chemistry and environmental science here at St. Norbert College. He's an environmental chemist with interest in biogeochemistry and the chemical ecology of aquatic systems. He has also contributed to dialogues between science and religion and how their interactions can be used to understand and advance the human condition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Poyster.
Thank you, Matt. Kenneth R. Miller is professor of biology at Brown University. He did his undergraduate work at Brown and earned a PhD in 1974 at the University of Colorado. He spent 6 years as assistant professor at Harvard University before returning to Brown in 1980. His research work on cell membrane structure and function has produced more than 60 scientific papers and reviews in leading journals, including Cell, Nature, and Scientific American. Miller is co-author with Joseph S. Levine of 4 different high school and college biology textbooks, which are used by millions of students nationwide. He has received 6 major teaching awards at Brown, the Presidential Citation of the American Institute for Biological Sciences in 2005, and the Public Service Award of the American Society of Cell Biology in 2006. In 2009, he was honored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science for advancing the public understanding of science, and also received the Gregor Mendel Medal from Villanova University. In 2011, he was presented with the Stephen Jay Gould Prize by the Society for the Study of Evolution. And in 2014, he received the Letari Medal from Notre Dame University. He is the author of the popular books Finding Darwin's God, A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution, and Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for the American Soul. His latest book, The Human Instinct, How We Evolved to Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will, was published in 2018 by Simon & Schuster. As a scientist interested in exploring ideas that form at the confluence of science and religion, I have found Miller's books to be rich sources of inspiration. For example, in Finding Darwin's God, Miller writes, "In the traditional view of God's power held by all Western religions, God's presence and his power are part of the continuing truth of existence. What this means, in plain and simple terms, is that ordinary processes, rooted in the genuine materialism of science, ought to be sufficient to allow for God's work, yesterday, today, and tomorrow." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth Miller.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm honored to present the Chu Lecture, and I'd like to thank Dr. Chu for making all of this possible. And above all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I appreciate the generous introduction, but when one goes out to speak, you never know how you're going to be introduced. So I always like to bring my own introductory slide so I can tell you who I really am. I'm a cell biologist. I've worked and researched and taught at Brown University, pardon me, for more than 4 decades. My main research tool is the electron microscope, and I've worked on biological membrane structure and function. Now, I have to tell you, I stand here with a certain amount of trepidation, and that is because I see a lot of young people in the room. And what I need to tell all of you in advance is that you probably already know me, and you may not like me. And the reason for that is if you used any of these books when you were in high school, I wrote them. So you owed that pain in your back from lugging that big heavy textbook around to me and to my co-author, Joe Levine. As you've just heard, I've also taken an interest in the public understanding of evolution, and I've written a series of other books. Finding Darwin's God deals basically with evolution and faith. Only a Theory was really about evolution and politics. And most recently, The Human Instinct, I wanted to address what evolution means for the human condition in a number of ways. Now, since I'm at a college, and actually just a few days ago, I was speaking in Philadelphia, I picked up an article from the student newspaper at Villanova, and this is probably old news to most of you in college. Unpaid internships are the new normal for college students. I find that to be an absolute bummer as somebody who always had to work in the summer to make spending money and pay room and board for the school year. The employers of an unpaid internship will tell you it's valuable experience, but as you know, you can't pay rent with valuable experience. But I try to encourage any of you seeking an unpaid internship by probably showing you the most famous and productive unpaid internship of all time. And that is when Charles Darwin set voyage on the Beagle for a voyage around the world that lasted almost 5 years. He wasn't paid anything either, but he took notes. And when he returned, at the end of his journey, he wrote an incredible book called The Voyage of the Beagle. He published it when he was 29 years old. It is still worth reading today. It's an incredible journey of observations about natural history, not just about evolution, but about the flora and fauna and even the indigenous peoples that he saw as he went around the world. The book is still in print, and I recommend it to any of you. Now, the interesting thing about this is we don't remember Darwin today just because of the Voyage of the Beagle. About 20 years later, he wrote another book, and that book is called The Origin of Species. That book landed like a cannon shot. And in particular, it dealt with our self-conception. Prior to Darwin's book, it's fair to say that the general conception of the origin of humankind was that we had a purely divine origin. And here you see a couple pieces of artwork designed basically to depict that. Now, the interesting thing about this is when the origin came out, the conflict with the story and the narrative in the book of Genesis seemed obvious. But Darwin himself, who took great pains never to offend religious sensibilities, particularly those of his wife, took great pains to avoid conflict. And here, for example, he wrote in the origin, "To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. When I view all beings, not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled." And you will see this throughout Darwin's writings, which is he sees a kind of nobility in the evolutionary process. Now, it's only fair to say that many people don't see it that way. And they look here at the stereotypical image of the evolution of man and say, this is ennobling? Not at all. And in fact, there's a story owing to the Victorian era that when Darwin's book became a bestseller, which indeed it was, individuals began to read it and were disturbed by it. And there's an apocryphal quote that goes around, but I think it tells the story very well. And that is someone, upon reading The Origin of Species, told their friends, "Let us hope that it is not true. But if it is true, let us hope that it does not become generally known." Now, as it turns out, when we moved from Victorian England to the United States, it turns out that in the United States, several places in the country did try hard to keep it from becoming generally known. And in Tennessee, for example, near the end of World War I, a law was passed called the Butler Act. And the Butler Act said it shall be unlawful for any teacher in the schools of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Well, I think you know what ensued from this, and that story has been told in a play and a movie called Inherit the Wind. And that is the prosecution of a Tennessee school teacher named John Scopes in Dayton, Tennessee. And I bring this up for several reasons, not the least of which is that this year is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. And therefore, basically, there are commemorations all around the country. I'm going to be speaking at several of them, and several other scholars of the Scopes trial will be as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is the protagonists in the play Inherit the Wind, two great actors, were chosen in part because of their physical resemblance to the two protagonists in the Scopes trial. Clarence Darrow, who defended John Scopes, the great defense attorney, and William Jennings Bryan, the great populist and one-time candidate for president of the United States, who served as the prosecutor in that case. Now, the interesting thing about the Scopes trial is if you watch Inherit the Wind, it will seem that the anti-evolution side, the prosecution side, was humiliated, was ridiculed. There was a little bit of that in the real Scopes trial. But the real Scopes trial is quite different from Inherit the Wind. And it's important to note that John Scopes was convicted and the Butler Act remained on the books. And all the way through the time that I was in high school, teaching evolution remained against the law. It remained banned in 6 states. Now, that's no longer the case today. When did that change? It changed in 1965 when a first-year high school teacher named second year, sorry, I put it right in the slide, I'm contradicting myself, in Little Rock, Arkansas, was told by her department supervisor when he looked at her lesson plans that she ought not to teach lessons on evolution. And the reason for that was because there was a law against it. And her supervisor told her, they didn't mind, but there is a law and you might get in trouble and you're too good a teacher and I don't want to lose you. So I want you to think about this, which is this young teacher's decided to sue the state of Arkansas on First Amendment grounds. And she was backed up by her teachers union in doing it. I think this took a phenomenal amount of courage. She won the lawsuit. The state appealed it to the state Supreme Court, and the Attorney General of Arkansas himself showed up to argue the case upon appeal. The Supreme Court of Arkansas reinstated the case. So Susan had no other choice but to take it to the Supreme Court of the United States, which she did. And in 1965, Epperson versus Arkansas was the case under which all of the anti-evolution laws were thrown out. Now, why do I bring this up? As you'll hear, 20 years ago, I testified in a case that had certain similarities, known as Kitzmiller versus Dover. Because I was the lead witness first day in the case, my name was in all the news stories, nightly news reports, stuff like that. I got a ton of emails, many of them critical, many of them laudatory, and I tried to answer each and every one of them. I read one email that intrigued me particular, and that email said, "Thank you very much for doing this in service to science. That's great." They said, I read one of your books. I really liked it. If I mailed you the books, would you autograph it for me? Of course I would. And then it said, "I think I know some of what you went through, because a number of years ago, I was involved in litigation on the theory of evolution too." And I thought, who is this? And I scrolled to the bottom of the email. It was Susan Epperson. And my heart skipped a beat. And I wrote back to her and said, "You don't have to tell me who you are. You are a rock star in my point of view. So I will autograph my book, but only under one condition. It's non-negotiable. And that is, you got to send me a picture of you that I can hang up in my office." So about 2 weeks later, I get a package. My book is in there, which I'm happy to sign. And there's this picture. And there's a very pretty young girl. That's obviously Susan. And she's sitting next to an old guy. And I don't mean to give offense to anybody in the audience, especially given my own age, but all 80-year-old guys look pretty much the same. And therefore, I had no idea who this is. So I turned the picture over, and written gently on the back is, "This is a picture of me and John Scopes." And John Scopes was not in good health, but he lived just long enough to see this courageous young educator invalidate the law under which he had been convicted. And to me, this certifies both of them as profiles in courage. Now, I'd love to say that Epperson versus Arkansas settled this, but you all know that it didn't. A number of years ago, I was approached by a former student of mine, Joe Levine, convinced me to write a high school biology textbook. We have done so. Our books have been successful enough to be in every state and several other countries, but occasionally they stir things up, and it all has to do with evolution. So in 2004, the good people of Cobb County, Georgia, or I should say the educators, picked our book as the biology textbook for all 13 high schools in Cobb County. Now, if you don't know Georgia, you should know Cobb County is a very large affluent suburb just north of Atlanta. But it turns out a local preacher discovered that our book just didn't have a chapter on evolution, had a whole unit on it, started a petition drive to convince the school board to teach creation science, so-called, along with evolution. Well, the school board's attorney said, "We can't do that. We'd get sued. There's Supreme Court precedent. But here's what we'll do for you. And that is, we will put a warning sticker in all the books." So our book, just like a pack of cigarettes, had a warning sticker placed in it. And here's what it said. "This textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered." Now, when this showed up, I was called up by a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And she asked me a very provocative question. And the question was, "Professor Miller, aren't you outraged by the stickers they put on your textbook?" Now, I'd been interviewed before, and I knew when somebody was trying to fish for an inflammatory quote. So she wanted a headline, something like, or Northern professor outraged at what school board is doing in Georgia. So I decided I would have some fun. And what I told her was, "No, I like the stickers." She said, "You do?" I said, "I absolutely do. They just don't go far enough." And she said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you look at that sticker. Basically, it tells me something, and that is, we are certain about every single theory and idea in this book except for one." And she said, "So that offends you as an evolutionist?" I said, "No, it offends me as a cell biologist, because it's telling students we know everything there is to know about cell biology, developmental biology, molecular biology, ecology. It's only evolution that's a little shaky." So at no charge, I offered to rewrite the sticker for Cobb County. And here's the sticker that I would put down. "This textbook has material on science, Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. Unfortunately, they did not take me up on this. 5 parents took them to court. I was asked to come down and testify, and lo and behold, the court found that it was a violation of the First Amendment because it was clearly an attempt to promote religion at the expense of science. That was my first stint in a court, other than a speeding ticket, I should say, when I was in grad school. That was my first stint in the courtroom, and certainly the first one as a witness. Didn't turn out to be my last. Only a few months later, a school board in eastern Pennsylvania, Dover, Pennsylvania, a really beautiful little town. The instructors, the high school teachers in Dover, were instructed to prepare an alternative curriculum to evolution on something called intelligent design. Now, the school teachers in Dover area high school, and there's only 3 biology teachers there, at the risk of losing their job, basically said, we won't do it because this stuff is not science. The school board then, and I want you to think of an elected board of education doing this, they then wrote a lesson on intelligent design. They bought intelligent design textbooks for the school library, and they asked the teachers, would you at least read the lesson to students? Once again, the teachers courageously refused. So the assistant superintendent on one day in 2004 had to go into the classroom and teach all the biology classes about intelligent design. The next day, 11 parents filed a First Amendment lawsuit, basically arguing that this was an attempt to promote what was fundamentally a religious view of origins in conflict with science. What happened then was extraordinary. This case was called Kitzmiller versus Dover because there were 11 parents who sued. Tammy Kitzmiller was the first one listed. And for many people, and this was very highly publicized, it fit the science versus faith stereotype almost perfectly. There were articles about it everywhere. There was an issue of Time magazine that presaged the trial, was devoted to what was called the Evolution Wars. The New Yorker wrote about this. It was an extraordinary thing. And I remember after my first day of testimony, flying home, to Providence. I got in my car at the airport. I turned on National Public Radio, and they headlined the news report by saying, it's God versus science in a Pennsylvania courtroom. That was the stereotype that basically they really wanted to promote. Now, the trial, as it turns out, went on for about 7 weeks. We had 5 expert witnesses. I was one of them, and I led the trial off. The other picture you see here is my good friend, Kevin Padian from Cal Berkeley. Kevin is a paleontologist. And we spoke about the status of evolution. We, in effect, gave lectures to the court. Kevin talked about fossils. One of my former students was a professor in the Philadelphia area. When he heard the testimony on fossils, he made up little bumper stickers as sort of a guerrilla theater project. And in the courtroom, he apparently snuck into the restrooms when the court was in trial, and he pasted all the restrooms with that sticker saying, we have the fossils, we win, which I thought was a very good way to summarize the testimony. As you'll hear, I talked about human molecular biology and about a few other things as well. The trial went on for quite a while. And one of the points that I tried to make during my testimony, it was that we did not appear out of nothing on this planet. We have an exceptionally well-documented ancestry. At this point, the human fossil record, or I should say the pre-human fossil record, is one of the most detailed of any mammalian species. It goes back several million years. It has transitional forms. We can see that we were preceded on this planet by a number of pre-human species. But I'm not really a fossil guy. And there's a better way to look at that. And that is to look directly in the human genome. And the most telling evidence for evolution is right there in the genome. This issue of Nature magazine, featuring the chimpanzee genome, came out when the trial was going on. And here's part of the text from the summary article. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that humans share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction and have refined the relationships between us, common chimpanzees, and as our closest evolutionary relative. Now, there's a lot of ways to explain this, But let me show you one particularly striking example. We humans have 46 chromosomes. Each of us got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. But all of the other great apes, all of our relatives, have 48 chromosomes. So a baby chimp gets 24 from mom and 24 from dad. Now, if we share a common ancestor with these guys, what happened to us? Why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? And you might say, well, maybe it just vanished. That's not possible. You can talk to any geneticist. The loss of both members of what's called a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You couldn't even get past embryonic development. So the only hypothesis that is consistent with these facts is that two chromosomes that are still separate in those other primates got accidentally stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. And, pardon me, and that would have dropped us from 24 pairs down to 23. Now, that is a conjecture. But here's the reason evolution is science, and that is it makes a testable prediction. And that is if we really do share common ancestry with these guys, somewhere in the human genome, we are carrying around, you and me and the person next to you are carrying around the remnants of this chromosome fusion. Now, how would we find it? Turns out to be way easier than you might think. And I made sketches of two chromosomes up here. The tips of every chromosome have a highly repetitive sequence in it called the telomere. I color that in blue. Near the center of every chromosome is an equally special region called the centromere. It's very important in cell division. If we have in our genome a chromosome that was formed by the fusion of these two, something like that, do you know what it would look like? It should have telomere DNA in the middle where it doesn't belong, and it should actually have two centromeres. So we can look at the genome, and if we don't find a chromosome like that, the whole hypothesis of common ancestry, this prediction, is falsified. But do you know what? It's human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 has every marker I just mentioned. And in case you haven't been following how much we know about our genome, the fusion site, if you will, the piece of Scotch tape holding the two chromosomes together, is between base 114,455,823 and 114,455,838. It has every marker you would expect for this. Now, I wanted to go a little bit further tonight and show you how dramatic this actually is. We used to call these chromosomes in the other primates chromosomes 12 and 13. We don't call them that anymore. If you look at the gorilla or chimpanzee genome, we call them chromosomes 2A and 2B. Why do we call them 2A and 2B? Because they correspond to the two halves of our second chromosome. And the map that you see up here shows how those two fit together. I can go in, and so could you, into what's known as a genome browser and look at the detailed sequence at the fusion site. The fusion site is right there, and you can see there are 4 genes, they're listed, to the left of the fusion site and 4 genes to the right. Where are those 8 genes on chromosomes 12 and 13 in the other primates? They're right at the end. So again, they match exactly the sequence. And if you go into the actual DNA bases, the A's, T's, G's, and C's, you will see something truly remarkable. That highly repeated sequence at the end of a human chromosome goes TTA-GGG, TTA-GGG. At the fusion site, that reverses. And instead of TTA-GGG, you get AAT-CCC. All the students in the room who know that A pairs with T and G pairs with C, that's the complementary sequence. So what that tells you is 2 chromosomes, one flipped around, fused together and form the fusion site. DNA sequences are not hypotheses or conjectures, they're facts. And there's no way to explain the fact of this in our genome other than saying we share a common ancestor with these other organisms. NOVA did a program on the trial, and this will capture some of the drama leading up to this trial in Pennsylvania 20 years ago. So what I want to show you is sort of the trailer for that trial. Here you go.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town
It's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
and puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day. Intelligent design on trial on Nova.
So I hope the narration was dramatic enough for you. But that was an extraordinary thing. And I always hesitate to show that because that really was me. The last thing there with considerably more hair than I managed to carry around today. This was an extraordinary documentary. It won the Peabody Prize for Broadcast Journalism. And I loved it because it told three stories. It told the scientific argument about evolution. It told the legal conflict in the meaning of the First Amendment. And above all, it showed how this issue really tore this small town apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor. People who loved and respected each other were suddenly at loggerheads, which was a tragic thing. Well, the decision was announced just before Christmas Day on 2005. That's the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me being cross-examined during the trial. And the judge, by the way, a lifelong Republican appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, said, look, intelligent design is simply not science. This was front page news on everything from the New York Times to USA Today. It was the lead story on the nightly news on all the networks that night. And it set off celebration among the parents who had gone to court to invalidate this particular policy. Now, once again, I'd love to pretend it's over. We've had this argument. The intelligent design advocates had their day in court, and they were unable to show that this was sound science, and they were unable, as the judge put it, to disentangle their ideas from religious doctrine. And I always like to emphasize that in reality, Kitzmiller was not a God versus science case. There are 4 books written about the trial. The best one was written by a local reporter named Lori Lebo. It's called The Devil in Dover, and it's just a remarkable book. Why do I say it wasn't God versus science? Well, first of all, the judge himself was a Christian. He was a Lutheran. 3 of the 6 expert witnesses, myself included, were people of faith. And one of them was a professor of theology at Georgetown. 7 of the 11 plaintiffs were active Christians, and 2 of them actually ran a Sunday school. And these were the plaintiffs who acted against intelligent design. But nonetheless, the view persists, and a lot of publicity about this trial promoted this view, that faith is the enemy of science and reason. And here you can see a candle burning in the darkness. That's a Carl Sagan metaphor, actually. And it says science, and you can see faceless or bodiless faces in the background saying, hit it with your Bible. The stereotype of science versus faith is everywhere. One of my friends in Florida took this picture of a local church, and you can see it says, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked this exact question. If man evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? And the last time I was asked that, I told the person who asked that, I said, sir, I'll answer that for you in a minute. But first I have a question for you, okay? Where did Protestants come from? And he looked a little confused and thought about it. And I said, now come on, 95 theses nailed to the church door, Martin Luther. I guess they came from Catholics. Right, are Catholics still here? Yeah, that's why monkeys are still here. Catholics and Protestants share a common Christian ancestry. We share a common biological ancestry with other primates. That basically is the answer. But the popular media still love the God versus science theme. Here's another Time magazine issue focusing on that exact point. And I have to tell you, so do many people in the scientific community. David Barash is a very distinguished biologist at the University of Washington, of whom I think very highly. But a number of years ago, he wrote this column, God, Darwin, and My Biology Class. And he goes, every year about this time, with the college year starting, I give my students the talk. It isn't, as you might expect, about sex, but it's about evolution and religion and how they get along. Or, more to the point, according to Dr. Barash, how they don't. Just as many Americans don't grasp the fact that evolution is not merely a theory, but the underpinning of all biological science, I agree with that, a substantial minority are troubled to discover that their beliefs conflict with the course material. And he writes, the more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. Now, it is true that scientific concepts like evolution seem to contradict the Bible. Evolution and Big Bang are just two of those. And these are troubling issues for people of faith, especially for Christians. I'm going to show you a clip from another NOVA show that sort of pinpoints the problem.
The majesty of our earth, the beauty of life, are they the result of a natural process called evolution, or the work of a divine creator? This question is at the heart of a struggle that has threatened to tear our nation apart.
That's an outdated religious book. Science is showing you
For
can't.
fundamentalist Christians like Ken Ham, evolution is an evil that must be fought.
You can't hold up your moral hand.
Well, I think it's a war. It's a real battle between worldviews.
For embattled teachers in Lafayette, Indiana, evolution is a truth that must be defended.
I think they think someone will come out a victor, and I don't believe that that's going to be the case.
If you look at the Bible,
For Christian students at Word College, evolution is an idea that is hard to accept.
Where is God's place if everything does have a natural cause?
For all of us, the future of religion, science, and science education are at stake in the creation-evolution debate. Today, even as science continues to provide evidence supporting the theory of evolution, for millions of Americans, the most important question remains: what about God?
And that was actually the name of that NOVA program in an 8-part series. So the question is, how can people of faith reconcile themselves to such ideas? And I'd like to point to a related idea that many people find troubling as well. And I often ask this to my own freshman biology students. It's not a biological question, but who is it who actually developed the mathematical foundations of cosmic expansion, which we call popularly the Big Bang? And the most popular candidate for this, which they name, is Albert Einstein. But it wasn't Einstein. And in fact, Einstein at first resisted the idea. It was this guy. And you can see he's wearing a clerical collar. And Einstein might have been a little bit suspicious of that clerical garb. He was actually a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Louvain in Belgium. His name was Georges Lemaitre. It is Lemaitre who first sat down with Einstein's equations for general relativity and worked them out to the point to show that they imply an expanding universe. It comes right out of the equations. This was a conclusion that Einstein resisted at first, but Lemaitre's mathematics was impeccable. And basically what Lemaitre showed is under general relativity, the universe is bigger today than it was yesterday. It will be bigger tomorrow than it is today. And if you go farther and farther into the past, the universe was smaller and smaller. And the logical extrapolation of that is at one point, the universe was infinitely small. That's the point. He called it the cosmic atom. And today we call what happened at that moment the Big Bang. So Georges Lemaitre, Father Georges Lemaitre, is in fact the father of the Big Bang. Now, the interesting thing about this is Lemaitre was often asked, the Big Bang doesn't sound a lot like in the beginning in the book of Genesis. But he understood that the Bible is not a book of science, and therefore it does not contradict science. There is, for those of you who are interested in Lemaitre, there is a wonderful book written by a friend of mine, John Farrell, called The Day Without Yesterday, about Lemaitre's work on the Big Bang. And Lemaitre answered questions this way. He said the writers of the Bible were illuminated more or less on the question of salvation, but on other questions they were just as wise or ignorant as those of their generation. So it's utterly unimportant if errors of historic or scientific fact should be found in the Bible, especially if errors relate to events that were not directly observed by those who wrote about them. Needless to say, no one was directly there to witness the creation of the universe. Now, Lemaitre is basically an intellectual antecedent of a great Catholic tradition of respecting science. And a few years ago, when Pope Francis was asked about this, he just sort of shrugged. And he said, of course, evolution and the Big Bang are real. The media professed shock and surprise. I was actually called up by both Time and Newsweek asking for a quote responding to this shocking statement by the Pope. And what I said was, this is the least surprising thing that Pope Francis has said so far in his papacy. And people forget that Pope Francis was originally trained as a scientist. He was trained as a chemist. And therefore, if you've ever read Laudato Si, the encyclical on ecology, you will realize this is a very, very scientifically literate person. And here you can see in another headline from the UK, Pope Francis declares evolution, Big Bang are real, and God is not a magician with a magic wand. And again, I gave an interview to the Catholic Herald in the UK. His comments are not revolutionary, and I argue they are very much in keeping with the very tradition that produced Lemaitre. That's the Big Bang. So what about evolution, which inspires so much resistance? And in fact, I've been handed all sorts of arguments against evolution. I've been challenged to debate, which I've done many times. I've been asked to write op-ed pieces to defend evolution, all of which I'm happy to do. But one of the things I like to do is to go back to Darwin. Darwin, after The Origin of Species was published, he was implored by many people to attack religion, to say that religious faith was nonsense. One of those people was Mr. John Fordyce. And we have thousands of letters from Darwin. This is one of them. And Fordyce asked Darwin to condemn religion. And what Darwin wrote, this is an important letter. He wrote, "Dear sir, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." Darwin said, "I have no doubt that at all." And then what he did is he pointed somebody out. And he named an American botanist, Asa Gray. Asa Gray was at Harvard. He was Darwin's first great advocate in the United States. He should be really remembered for much more than he is. He has been commemorated on a U.S. postage stamp, as you can see. Asa Gray was an advocate for evolution. He was also an elder in the Presbyterian Church. And he argued very, very passionately that evolution and faith were compatible. And I want to give you another voice along those lines. This is Teodosios Dobzhansky, probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century, who established many fundamental principles about gene drift and flow and so forth. Dobzhansky was a Christian. He wrote a remarkable article for teachers, actually. This is the American biology teacher, saying nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That slogan is something that any biologist would nod to. That's right. And he wrote, "The organic diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. It's wrong to hold evolution and creation as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway today." Pope Benedict was also asked about this by a group of Italian journalists. And I want to show you, Pope Benedict tended to talk in a sort of complicated lingo that I would call Pope speak. And you'll see what I mean. He said, "The contrast between evolution and creation is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. If you find that a little bit confusing, do what I do. Go to that publication that, for me, clears everything up. That's the New York Post." And they said, "God and evolution do mix, Pope." End of story. So here's the way in which I would put it. Life is material. This is by one of the few things that Madonna consistently got right when she said we're living in a material world. Life is material, and the capacity for life is built into the physics and chemistry of matter. Evolution, therefore, is an inherent and predictable part of nature, and if the ultimate cause of the natural world is God, then evolution reflects nothing so more as his creative power. So in a very real sense, an evolutionary design to life is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. So here's the lesson. The capacity for evolutionary change is built into nature, allowing believers to understand it as part of God's providential plan. I'm not the only biologist who feels that way. This is Simon Conway Morris, a very distinguished British paleontologist who's written a marvelous book called Life's Solution: Human Existence in a Lonely World, arguing, in effect, that the emergence of intelligent life, given the physical conditions of the universe, is inevitable. Not in a particular time frame, but somewhere, sometime in this vast universe, intelligence will evolve, and that's us. So the way in which I would look at the earth is this way. Many people have asked me, well, if you're a person of faith, where do you find room for God in the evolutionary process? Where does God tinker to make us come out just the way we did as hairless bipedal primates? And my answer is we don't have to find room for God in the evolutionary process because the process itself is part of a natural world of his own making. And if God's creation fulfills his will, then evolution is part of that will. And you might ask, what kind of God could exist in a scientific world where nature acts according to orderly, predictable rules that we can study, understand, and describe? And the answer is very simple. A God who fashioned a world that is itself rational and intelligible. So to people of faith, God is not the antithesis of scientific reason. He can be understood as the reason why science works in the first place. And I think that's a very important point. Now, what many people tell me is, the world is just too cruel for me to be a person of faith. The cruelty of a struggle for existence is incompatible with a merciful God. The cartoon of evolution is it's nature red in tooth and claw, and it doesn't fit with the idea of a loving God. And when I show this image from the Sistine Chapel to my secular colleagues at the university, often I have to interpret it for them. So I said, let me explain to you what we have here. And that is, we have 2 junior faculty, and they are just getting the thumbs down from the tenure committee, and they are both being exiled to spend the rest of their careers at the local junior college. Now, not that there's anything wrong with junior colleges, please don't get me wrong, but the idea of nature red in tooth and claw, struggling for existence, that really comes right out of the book of Genesis. Darwin was worried about this too, however, and he wrote, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created I'm a biologist, and I have trouble with this, Ichynomonidae, which is a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs on caterpillars, and they then devour the caterpillar while it's still alive, with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. And you know what? I can't believe that either. What I can believe is that an evolutionary process would explore all possible areas for existence, one of which, quite frankly, would be parasitism, and therefore it makes sense. So I put it this way. All organisms are born to die. That's an observable fact, not an invention of Darwin. I was once interrupted by a student who raised her hand, and she said, well, I'm a vegetarian. I'm a vegan, actually, and no organism has to die to provide me with life. So there. And I said, well, look, let me put it this way. My doctoral thesis is on the structure of the photosynthetic membranes of Spinacia oleracea, which is spinach. And I want to tell you that the structure of the photosynthetic architecture within the spinach membrane is absolutely beautiful and exquisite. Do you ever have spinach in your salad? Oh, of course I do. Well, I estimate that with every bite of a spinach salad, you are condemning 25,000 of these beautiful chloroplasts to death, and it makes me very sad. So it is true that all life comes at the expense of other life. And that's true whether you're a carnivore, a vegan, or a vegetarian. That's an important thing. So that's not a fact of Darwin. Oh, I'm sorry, did it again. That's an observable fact, not an invention of Charles Darwin. In a material world, life only comes at the cost of death. That's a fact. That's not Charles Darwin. And I would say that just as sin defines virtue, from the struggle for existence comes what I would call the evolutionary possibility of perfection. Is evolution consistent with the character of the Christian God? I would argue yes, because the alternative to an evolving world is one that is fixed, inflexible and static, one that never changes. The message of Christianity is one of possibility, of redemption, of human freedom. These values are inconsistent with a fixed creation in which the possibilities for the future are predetermined. What evolution does is leave the future open and undetermined. So evolution as a science of biological possibility is perfectly consistent with the Christian theology of spiritual possibility. Now, Richard Dawkins, many of you may know, is a great evolutionary biologist and a great advocate for the public understanding of evolution. He is also very much a crusading atheist. His best-selling book of all times is not a biological book, but a theological one called The God Delusion. And Richard, whom I very much admire, in that book wrote, "The Darwinian universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." I happened to have shared the platform with Richard 3 or 4 times, and on one of the last times we got together, I read that quote to him, and I said, "Richard, do you really get up in the morning thinking no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference?" And he looked at me in his best Oxford Don style, and he said, "Well, the world may not have a purpose, but I do." So there it was, and that was his answer. But what's his reason for this conclusion? It is a true fact that the physical universe seems cold, indifferent, and maybe even hostile to life. But I asked him the following: how do you know the universe lacks a purpose? Purpose is not a testable scientific concept. Are purpose and evil testable scientific concepts? Not at all. They're philosophical concepts. So I would, and I think many of my colleagues would point out, that this cold universe also contains the physical and chemical potential that makes life possible. And I would cite fellow scientists who are also Christians, like John Haught at Georgetown, like Francis Collins, formerly the director of NIH, Dobzhansky, who I mentioned, and Francisco Ayala. They would look at the universe and they would take the Dawkins quote and they'd rewrite it like this: "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world and committed to a promise of human freedom." That's not a scientific statement, but neither is Dawkins. But it is equally consistent with what we know about the universe from science. So I want to go back to my friend David Barash's his column in the New York Times about God, Darwin, and my biology class. And he wrote, "Evolution has demolished previously potent pillars of religious faith and undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God." And he writes, "An entirely natural and undirected process, random variation, natural selection, that's all that's needed to generate extraordinary levels of non-randomness. Living things are wonderfully complex, but altogether within the range of a statistically powerful but mechanical phenomenon." So I contemplate that. And I would say, Dr. Barash, is it really a problem to point out that life was generated by purely natural processes? I remember a quote from St. Augustine: "The universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structure and life forms." This is Augustine, the great theologian, saying basically the universe is generated through material phenomena. Now, ironically, the two extremes of creationism and scientific materialism both seem to agree that God has to act directly to create living things. And that what they both ignore is a critical observation from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a paleontologist and Jesuit, that God does not so much make the world of life as to allow the world of life to make itself. So I would go back and look at Barash again. No literally supernatural trait has ever been found in Homo sapienses. We are perfectly good animals, natural as could be, indistinguishable from the rest of the living world. That's true. But it is a problem to think we are ordinary part of the natural world. I remember a quote, and I don't think it came from Darwin, which is, "Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return." The recognition that we are material beings is part of Scripture itself. And that's an important point. Then he says, The more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a totally amoral process, no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. It is true, the process of evolution does not require God as an explanation. That's why a person of faith and a person who's not faith can agree on the evolutionary process. So you can ask a question. Why should nature support the extravagant creativity of the evolutionary process? Science has no answer, but faith may see this as the work, as I do, of that very same creator. So my lesson to Professor Barash would skip the talk, focus on biology itself, and if his students truly understand the science, they will come to their own reconciliation. Now, does this mean the Bible should be read as a scientific textbook? And the answer is no. And here's another quote from Augustine, same book that I just referenced. And Augustine was remarkable. If he was alive today, he'd be an evolutionist, trust me. He says, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones. And I'm going to translate that into 20th century lingo. Even a non-Christian knows something about geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and so forth. He's certain of that from reason and experience, from science. Now it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for a non-believer to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. And we should take all means to prevent an embarrassing situation in which people show up scientific ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. And I think Augustine was right. Now, I've been asked by other people, what kind of science do you get following Augustinian precepts? Well, I think I can answer that. And I can point out a priest in the Augustinian monastery in Brno, Czechoslovakia, named Gregor Mendel. And that priest basically established the modern science of genetics. So what sort of science do you get if you follow Augustinian precepts? The answer is you get darn good science, you get genetics. Here are my closing points. And I reference a marvelous book called The Sun in the Church by David Heilbrunn. And he wrote this book many years ago, and he wanted to contradict the idea that the church in medieval ages was a hotbed of anti-science superstition. And he did this by pointing something out, that many cathedrals in Europe will have a very tiny hole in the roof through which on a sunny day a beam of sunlight will come down. And on the open floor of many cathedrals, there is often a metal rod with markings on it. That metal rod and that hole were kind of a solar observatory. And they were used to spot basically the vernal equinox in order to fix the first day of spring, in order to fix Passover and Easter. The church was, in effect, the funding agency for science throughout much of medieval times. So here's the way I'd like to close. Faith suffered to the extent that it rejects the gifts of understanding that science provides. I think it is very important for Christians of all denominations to open themselves to scientific understanding. I think science suffers by means of the deep hostility, often unreasoning, by many scientists to any form of faith. And finally, in reality, science and faith both arise from the same human need, the desire to understand. Charles Krauthammer, and he was writing about the Kitzmiller trial, summed it up, I think, perfectly. And he wrote a column about this intelligent design trial called Phony Theory, False Conflict. And here's what he said. How ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more creative, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct yet interactive, all ultimately derive from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And finally, and I don't want to end on a note like that. I want to end on a different note. A long time ago, during the Darwin Centennial in 2009, I was actually able to see this page of this notebook. And it's a remarkable document. It was sketched out in 1839 or 1840. And the person who wrote it took a page of the notebook. He wrote, I think, and then he made us a kind of a tree sketch And no one had ever made a sketch like this before. And then in his very bad handwriting, he wrote a little bit of explanation on the bottom. Then he came back a couple weeks later in the upper right-hand corner, he wrote some more. And that person also wrote a book that you've all heard of. And I want to read you the closing passages of that book. And that is, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the last sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and I think those are words to live by. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, as our evening concludes, I have just a few quick closing remarks. Number one, we're grateful here that this is the 10th anniversary since the renovation of our own science building, GMS Hall. So that's one thing to celebrate here with this great lecture. For the conclusion of this talk here, there is a dessert reception available just outside of the theater here, and all are welcome to spend some time enjoying hospitality before you leave. We can continue the conversation with Dr. Miller and among each other. While there, I also hope you take some time to appreciate some of the beautiful banners that are in that space. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Michael Holstead. I don't know, is he right here? There he is, up in the corner of the Center for Norbertine Studies for his work on developing these great banners. These banners are depicting great Norbertine scientists from throughout the generations, so please check that out. When he made his generous donation, Dr. Chu noted the importance of Norbertine educators in his development, and the banners illuminate the scientific contributions by Norbertines across the centuries and around the globe. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Benjamin Chu Lecture Committee, including Dr. Jamie Lynch, Dr. Michael Holstead, Dr. David Poyster, and Dr. Andrew O'Connor, with special thanks to Martha Kiedrowski and our communications team for all their hard work to make this event possible. And with all that, let's conclude again, thanking Dr. Miller, and have a great night.